students, and welcome back to College Football 101 at Bensylvania University. I'm your Professor Ben, and if you recall, in our last lecture, Rutgers University and Princeton had engaged in the first series of intercollegiate football matches. Now, this football games that they played were not anything close to the modern football that we are used to here in America, and actually this lecture is going to be how we get from that association football-based rule set that Princeton and Rutgers used to football as we know it, at least 80 to 90% of it today. But first, we go back to 1869 when Rutgers and Princeton played in two games against each other in intercollegiate football. Now, these games were a success, maybe not monetarily a success, but they were enjoyable for the students that were involved, and so they decided that they would spread the game around. This game spread quickly. Princeton obviously challenged Rutgers to the original game. Rutgers pulls in Columbia University, and Columbia pulls in Yale University. And collectively, these Northeastern teams create what they call or create their own rule set in 1873. A lot of these schools have come together and they're going to be playing now under these association style rules. But notable by their absence is the most prestigious university in the United States, Harvard. See, Harvard was a stickler and they wanted to continue to play under their Bloody Monday rules as opposed to playing under the association rules that the other universities were playing under. And they did this for about a year until 1874 when McGill University, a Canadian institution, challenges Harvard to a football game. See, McGill was in the rugby style football sphere of influence. They actually believe that it was probably originally taught to them by some English army, soldiers. It makes sense because they were a part of the Commonwealth at the time. But McGill played with rugby style rules, and in the general fashion of the day, they decided to play two games versus Harvard, one under Harvard rules and one under McGill rules. And to the shock of the Harvard players, they discovered that they enjoyed rugby style football a whole lot more than their Bloody Monday style football. And so Harvard, from that point forward, picked up the rugby style game over their Bloody Monday rules. And in the grand tradition, they also decided that they should spread these rules to their fellow American universities, most notably Yale. See, Yale and Harvard had an athletic tradition going back at least 50 years at this point, around the 1820s, at the very latest, the 1830s. The Harvard and Yale crew teams annually had a crew, rowing competition against each other. These was really the first intercollegiate athletic rivalry in the United States. And so obviously Harvard had to get Yale on board with their new style of play. So Harvard challenges them to a rugby game. And just like Harvard, when McGill played them, Yale figures out that they like rugby style rules better. And eventually these rugby style rules start to spread. And this is in 1875. Really, these transition away from the association style rules to a more rugby style rules begins in 1875. But really, the genesis of American football as we know it begins in 1876, the very next year, when a young man by the name of Walter Camp joins the Yale football team. So here's a poorly drawn picture of Walter Camp with his large sideburns and mustache, but Walter Camp was a pure athlete from a very young age. Camp had always had a desire to play, in sports. And so once he got to Yale University, obviously he picked up sports right away. And most notably, he joined the football team and was almost immediately one of the best players on the football team. He was decisive in many games for the Yale, what would become the Yale Bulldogs, the Eli. He was a great player. In 1878, he becomes the captain of the Yale football team. And as he becomes captain, another trait of Camp, which will spring up throughout the course of this lecture, become known. The fact that Camp was a bit of a control freak. Um, if he had his options or he had his way, everybody would be following whatever he said whenever possible because he thought that he had the best knowledge. And quite often he did have a lot of a great knowledge, especially about the game of football. Several times, at least a couple of times before major games, Camp would quit the team if he thought that the team was disrespecting him by not following his instructions, knowing that the team would have to come crawling back to him because they would not be able to win the game without their star player. And so Camp would begrudgingly come back if, they actually followed his instructions. And, following his instructions, they would win games. So Camp, beginning in 1878, kind of becomes the core of the Yale football team. And even more so, just 2 years later, he starts becoming the core of football as a whole in the United States. See, in 1878, when he becomes captain, he also begins attending the annual rules meeting. This is the IFA, the International Fraternity of, or it's not that. Where is it? The Intercollegiate Football Association. That's the name. The IFA is created in 1876 under these new rugby style rules. This is the rules committee for football at the time. And Camp in 1878 begins attending these meetings. And when he comes to these meetings, he has two rules that he wants placed on the docket to be discussed and hopefully ratified. The first rule is that the number of players on the field be reduced from, I believe, 15 down to 11. And the second rule is he comes with the concept of the scrimmage. Originally, in 1878, these rule changes are rejected. They're rejected again in 1879. In 1880, the scrimmage and 11 men on the field become rule. So what is the scrimmage? So under rugby rules, continuing to this day, once a player who is carrying the ball is tackled, the ball is placed on the ground and the two teams come together and they form what they call a scrummage, where the teams push each other back and forth, attempting to maintain control of the ball so they can kick the ball out from underneath the two teams in the scrummage to one of their players who begins the next play. This was how it was in football up until 1880 when Camp finally gets the scrimmage rule passed. See, Camp, again, he was a bit of a control freak, and he didn't like the idea that, or I guess more, he didn't like the chance involved in the scrummage. You don't know what's going to happen in a scrum. The ball could end up on your team and you maintain possession, or the ball can end up on the other team and they now have turned, the possession has been turned over. Camp wanted the team who had the ball to maintain possession. The scrimmage, the ball would be placed on the ground and the team would kick the ball back to the quarterback or the new quarterback position, and they would put the ball in play once again, maintaining possession. And also, not only is this a selfish thing about wanting offenses to keep the ball, this creates more strategy in the game. See, with the scrimmage, you know for certain whether or not your team will have the ball on the next play or not. And so you can thereby, plan accordingly what your next play will be instead of a scrum where you never know what's going to happen and then the ball gets shot out somewhere randomly for the most part and then you have to play from there. With the scrimmage, it becomes a much more scientific and strategic game. And in 1880, they begin this rule, and right from the beginning, the rule is popular, but there are flaws with the scrimmage system. See, in 1861 and 1862, there were several notable games between the major powers, mostly these bigger Eastern teams like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. Those are the big three of Eastern football at this period. But amongst these teams, there's this idea of the stall game that takes effect. See, under the rules of the day, in order for a new champion to be crowned, much in the way of boxing or wrestling or something like that, the original or the older champion had to be beaten in order to declare a new champion. So, I don't remember the exact teams, but we'll say in this case, Princeton is the defending champion, and Yale is playing a game against them. They're their one opponent that they really have a shot of beating. Princeton in becoming champion. So Princeton receives the ball at the kickoff. And now, under these scrimmage rules, unless they fumble or somehow turn over the ball, they can maintain possession as long as they want. And Princeton realizes that they don't even have to win the game in order to maintain the championship. The least they could do is tie and still maintain the championship. And the tie is a lot easier to get than the victory, especially at this point in time. And so Princeton begins playing with the stall game. They play as carefully and cautiously with the football as they can, and they end up controlling the possession of the ball the entire first half of the game. And obviously that leads to a 0-0 time at halftime, and Yale gets the ball in the second half. Now, Yale is also stuck in a situation. Yale does not want to outright lose to Princeton. Yale needs to win. But if they were to be a little bit more exuberant and maybe a little less cautious, they could turn over the ball in their own half of the field, allowing Princeton an easy, touchdown, field goal, whatever, to give them the win. So Yale also goes into a very conservative mode of football, attempting to creep the ball down the field, to try to score within the last, final seconds in order to take away this victory. But Yale, unfortunately, was not able to complete that, and the game ends in a 0-0 tie with very little offense on either side of the ball, or either team producing very little offense. So these stall games become a trademark of the 1881 and the 1882 season, when Camp comes back to the IFA, who now, at least starting at this point, begins to view Camp as the leader of football, the guy who came up with these new great ideas. And Camp devises a system of down and distance as we know it today. Under Camp's rules, the team with the offensive possession, the team with the ball, must proceed or must go forward 5 yards in 3 downs, or lose 10 yards in 3 downs, in order to maintain possession of the ball. If they do not do that, then the ball gets turned over automatically to the other team. So this produces a reason for teams to actually try to score offensively. It makes offense a necessity instead of a hindrance under the stall system. So Camp is able to solve the scrimmage problem. See, the scrimmage alone doesn't work unless you have a down and distance in order to, push the teams into offense. And under these new rules, this down and distance scrimmage system, football really begins to take shape as we know it today. People argue a lot about what could be considered the first football game. The NCAA recognizes the Rutgers-Princeton game of 1869 as the first football game. I used to think it was 1875 McGill-Harvard because that's the first rugby style. But really, if you truly think about it, if you were to drop somebody in from today back in time, you would say, this is football, this is American-style football, the first time they would truly be able to distinguish American football from any other form of football would be somewhere in this 1880 to 1882 era, probably 1882, if we're all honest about it. But Camp doesn't end there. Camp continues to innovate his new rules for football. In 1883, he comes up with a point system, which is something that's incredibly unknown for sports at this time. See, every other sport, baseball, soccer, and of itself, rugby, they are played by goals or runs in baseball. Anytime you do the proper action that is requested in the game by the purpose of the rules of the game, you gain 1 point. If you were to circle the bases one time, you get 1 run. If you were to kick the ball through the uprights, you get 1 point, or 1 goal in soccer. If you were to put the ball over the line in the rugby field and touch it down, then you get 1 try, I think is what it is in rugby. But Camp devises a point system. And the interesting thing about this point system is that over time, because it's not perfect right away. And actually, in 1883, a touchdown, as we know it today, was worth 2 points. A field goal from the field is worth 5 points, and the point after try, after you score the touchdown, the conversion kick is worth 4 points. That's 1883. But you can see where camp is going with these rule changes, with the point system in the very next year in 1894. See, they raise the amount of points that a touchdown is worth by double. They raise it from 2 to 4 points. They lower the amount of points that a conversion kick gets all the way down from 4 to 1, and they maintain the field goal at 5. But really, this is showing that this game is eventually shifting away from a kicking game where you're kicking to score goals, see most of the points, and really up until this point system, the only way that you scored any points was if you got a touchdown. The touchdown itself didn't count as points. When you kicked the conversion, that counted as a goal, or if you got a goal from the field. It was the kicking that gave all of the points. But Camp realized that a major, major change in this game, a major focus of this game was the, scoring touchdowns. And so eventually, the rules begin to favor scoring touchdowns as a method of scoring points, as opposed to, kicking field goals as a method of scoring points. Eventually, in 1912, the modern system of points, 6 points for a touchdown, 1 point for an extra point, and 3 points for a field goal, becomes the standard. But even before that, and even by the right around the turn of the century, it's really heavily shown that the touchdown is beginning to outscore and thereby actually be worth more than a field goal. Again, changing the system or changing the goal of the game from a kicking game to a running and in a catching game, even more than rugby. So yes, he creates this point system which de-emphasizes kicking. He also, by 1888, Camp is basically the undisputed leader of football in America. He is the father of this American football game. He is the James Naismith, and we'll mention him briefly later on. But he is basically, at least very much so in the eyes of the culture, he is the inventor of football as they knew it. Even though, again, we've discussed there's been a long history of evolution that has led to American football as it stands. But Camp, especially in the eyes of the people around him, was the sole creator of American football. And so he becomes the ultimate arbiter of quality of American football. And in that role, he creates the All-American team, a list of the best players in the country, decided by Camp, and maybe some people who scouted for him or whatever, but mostly eyes seen by Camp. Camp's going around the country and watching all these games to determine who the best players are, and they're going on his All-American team. Now, the problem, and we'll discuss it more when we get here, is that football at this time is a very sectional game, meaning that geographic areas of the country, they don't really cross. Again, this is before the turn of the 20th century, there's no roads, there's horse trails and stuff like that. The best way you could travel from state to state was by rail, and even then it was very slow. So people generally stayed within a relatively localized area. So even Camp struggled to find great players out west because he couldn't see them. He could see the games in the Northeast, again, where all these Ivy League schools are. And so this creates a bias in the media and in just football culture for these big Eastern schools as opposed to the Western schools. And we'll discuss more about this, especially going on in the next lecture. And as we talk about the 1910s and 1920s, that's really where this geographic rivalries start to come in a little bit more. But anyway, in 1988, he creates the All-American team. And in that same year, as much as the scrimmage and down and distances, the foundational sets of rules for American football, really, I think the most important rule change happens in 1888 when blocking and tackling below the waist are permitted. Again, these are Walter Camp innovations. So under the rules previous to 1888, the game, even though you had the scrimmage and down and distance, the game looked on the field a lot more like rugby does today, where your team is spread out all along what would become known as the line of scrimmage, and you would pass the ball back and forth between each other. If you got tackled, yes, then you would have a scrimmage. The ball would kicked in, and then the next player, next play goes down. But under these new blocking and tackling systems, the game begins to compress. See, tackling below the waist is much easier than tackling above the waist. See, obviously, if you're allowing tackling below the waist in 1888, that means that tackling was restricted to above the waist prior to that, just like it is in modern day rugby. And any modern day rugby player, as opposed to a football player, would tell you that's a lot harder to tackle somebody above the waist than below the waist. Even modern football coaches still, over 100 years later, over 140 years later, teach their players to go low if they want to tackle somebody, because it's so much easier to knock somebody off balance from the base instead of from the top, because weebles wobble but they don't fall down. So tackling in the open field becomes much more dangerous. They're not dangerous in a physical sense. It does, but again, we'll touch on that later. But for the actual advancement of the ball in the terms of the game, it's a lot harder, or it's a lot easier for the defenders to tackle players in the open field, which is why there's an increased reliance on blocking. See, now the only way to really stop an opponent from tackling your player, if the player was by himself, he's probably going to get tackled unless he's a very skilled player. But those very skilled players are few and far between. So how do you stop them from being tackled? You put blockers out there to, get in the way of the potential tacklers, to, allow the players to run free. And so this really changes the game. So it goes from this whole spread out formation all the way from, sideline to sideline to very centralized formations, allowing blockers to do their jobs. Even like this formation here, this comes from Amos Alonzo Stagg, we'll talk about it later. As you can see, it's very centralized. This here, is, if that's your player, your actual, field width is all the way out here to here, just like you see in modern day football. It's so collapsed versus, say, if you see in a rugby game before, where you see players spread evenly all the way across the field. Everybody's collapsed in here so that they can block for whoever has the ball. Now, this new blocking and tackling system, again, introduces a lot more strategy to the game, even more strategy than was provided by scrimmaging and down and distance. See, again, even with scrimmaging and down and distance, you could call plays, but in the end, just like in rugby, it's a lot more of a loose feeling game, a lot more improvisational, or very more improv based, where you toss the ball and you toss the ball back, and you go around, you eventually find a hole and you clear through the hole, or you make a guy miss and then you go through. In this game, with blocking and tackling below the waist, it's a very heavily skewed towards the defense. The defense has it much easier than the offense when it comes to stopping the ball versus trying to advance the ball. It's a lot harder to break through a defense now. And so players have to come up with more strategic ways in order to block for blockers and eventually be able to move the ball forward if they want to score points. Really, this system of football that really appears after the 1889 or 1888 season, it's generally called scientific football as opposed to soccer or rugby or stuff like that, because it's really a chess game between the two teams, between how are we going to stop the offense and how is the offense going to try to move the ball. And we're going to talk about how it ends up, or this, even though the scientific football creates a base for exciting play, it also creates a sense of danger to those who are playing the game. But before that, with these rules now in place, the game of football begins to spread. It begins to spread quickly. See, in 1879, what some people consider the first football game played west of the Allegheny Mountains happens when the University of Michigan, probably, the largest college in the East, or in the West as it was known then, away from the original 13 colonies. The University of Michigan plays Racine University in a football game. Again, played mostly under the association style rules, but this is deemed the first intercollegiate football game west of the Alleghenies. Now, there are some people that argue that in 1873 there was a football game between the Virginia Military Institute and Washington and Lee University. Um, but it's uncertain if this game actually took place, and if so, again, it was not probably played. It was definitely not played under rugby style rules before McGill comes into the United States to play Harvard. It was definitely played under more association style rules, but the game, even before all these innovations, is being played on college campuses around the country. But after the foundation, or uh, the or the cementing, that's the word I was looking for. After the cementing of football rules as we mostly know them today, the game spreads quickly. Uh, See, if we were to really look at the South again, there's another game that may have taken place in 1888 or 1880 between Transylvania University and Center College in Kentucky. Um, but the final score of that game supposedly was 13 3/4 to 0, and I don't know how that necessarily happens under any form of rules. So I would argue that that game probably also didn't happen. It's more apocryphal, but we do know for certain that the first Southern football game played under scientific football rules, these camp rules, was in 1888 between the University of North Carolina and their arch rival Duke University. So that's the South. Eventually, football spreads down to Georgia and Alabama in the early 1890s, along with out west. The University of South Carolina plays their first football game. I always do that. The University of Southern California, probably the true USC, plays their first football game in 1888. Texas plays their first football game in 1893, followed shortly by their bitter rival Oklahoma in 1895. Colorado in the Midwest, as we know it today, the Mountain West, plays their first football game in 1890. Iowa University plays it in 1889. The Ohio State University plays it in 1890. And even we can finally say that football has spread coast to coast by Oregon playing football in 1894. See, the game takes a mere 6 years for it to trickle all the way across the country. So why then, especially in this age when there isn't really such a thing as mass culture? See, again, mass culture requires a mass media. It requires a nationwide media like radio or television or the internet. So how did we get this mass spread of football in such a short period of time? Because obviously, yes, it's going to spread. It'll go from, Michigan to Iowa to, Ohio to all the way down. But in this, especially with this, section of, sorry, there's ambulances going on outside. This barren stretch in the Great Plains, how does it spread so fast? Well, I think there is a prime desire for football on these college campuses. It was something for students to do. See, school was boring. School has always been boring to a certain degree. But for college students, these are young men. I do specifically say men because at this time there wasn't a whole lot of women in academia. So these are mostly young college-aged men that are all have left their homes and they are living all together at a university campus. So we've already discussed in the last lecture how there's always a proclivity to play games amongst men. And so this proclivity to play games catches on to this Walter Camp scientific American-style football like gangbusters. It really captures the imagination, and especially because during their free time prior to this, students did arguably very boring things. The most culture that they had was like debate clubs with between themselves, or other academic pursuits outside of their studies. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and so there was a huge desire for something fun for students to do to take their minds off of school. And so these students become obsessed very quickly with college football. They want something to do. And so they pour their time, money, and effort into the football teams, whether it's, it gives them something to discuss, outside of classes. You're not talking about classes or talking about deep philosophical things all the time, which even as much as you love to do that, that's not something you can do 100% of your time without, frying your brain. It gives them some, what we would call in modern days water cooler talk. You could say, hey, how was, or, did you see the results in the paper from the game on Saturday? Did you go to the game on Saturday? It gives students an outlet for their creative endeavors. They can go and they can root for their teams, and they can go and play on their teams. It gives them something to do instead of sitting in their room studying all day. And even especially for young men, even in the 1890s, where somebody was 14, was basically considered an adult and may have been working in the mines. These men, it gave them something enjoyable to do. Just like how baseball, especially in these eastern cities, when it first started, it gave the young men something to do besides work and sleep and eat. It gave them a third fun thing to do. That happens on the college campuses with football. And not only that, not only is the youth primed for something fun to do, the culture, or as much of a culture as you can call it, on the whole, is also primed for athletics. See, around this time in the late 19th century, there's this movement in favor of athletics. See, when we get to the turn of the 20th century, that's when the Olympics start back up again. In 1900, this is the first modern Olympic Games. There is a big movement towards athletics that previously people may have been approved of for being athletic individuals, but it wasn't something to desire. The leisurely pursuits of a gentleman did not need you to be athletic. You needed to be academically smart. But under this new athletic system, like shown by what I would consider the Christian athletics movement, identified by the YMCA. Again, James Naismith coming up there, and we'll get to him even more a little bit later. But these organizations come up trying to show that athletics is good not only for the body but also for the mind and for the soul and for moral rectitude. Because instead of carousing at bars or doing bad things, they can spend their time doing athletics. Um, so the culture itself is pushing, especially young men, towards athletics. Number three, the third reason why I think football spread so rapidly is the desire for prestige for universities. We're going to discuss this a little bit more, but universities quickly realized that having a competitive football team got their names out there, increasing the prestige for the university. And along with the competitive football team also came the fourth reason, which is just straight up money. People realized quickly that football made money. It was basically a professional sport to a certain degree. It brought in money, it brought in prestige, whether directly via sales of tickets or eventually what would become like merchandise and stuff like that, or if it was just people coming to the university, becoming students there because they had heard of the university because they had a great football team. Football brought in money to the universities. Um, but even showing this, a proof of how football could cause popularity and thereby increase the prestige of universities comes from what we now consider a very prestigious academic university, the University of Chicago. See, the University of Chicago was founded in the 1890s. In 1892, their first president was a guy by the name of William Harper. He was an ex-Yale professor. I believe he taught theology at Yale or philosophy or something along those lines. But he was now serving as the president of the University of Chicago. And again, being from Yale, he had, grown up and he had seen the rise of football culture under Camp, and he realized that having a good football team could make the university better known, around the country and make it more prestigious. So he decided that his one of his major goals when really starting up this university was that they were going to make a good football team. And in order to make a good football team, they needed a good football coach. Um, and so they went and they found a guy by the name of Amos Alonzo Stagg. See, before Stagg, generally when a lot of these universities founded their football teams, they would write to Camp or they would write to one of the major universities, football playing Eastern schools, and say, "Do you have any players that you can send to teach us how to play football?" Um, and under that system, they had a lot of players came out of it. A lot of ex Yale and Harvard and Princeton players became coaches. See, 45 Yale players, ex players, became coaches at these schools. 35 Princeton players and 24 Harvard players also followed them. But coaching at this time was a little different than what we think of it now. They all generally follow the model of Camp. See, Camp served as the de facto coach for the Yale football team, but he wasn't a coach in the modern sense. See, a modern coach goes and he stands on the sidelines, he calls the plays, and he's always involved in practices. He's always, his whole life is eating and breathing and sleeping and talking about the football team and thinking about football. Camp did eat, breathe, and sleep football, but he wasn't employed by Yale to be their head football coach. In fact, he was a watchmaker. He worked at a watch manufacturing company in New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale is. Um, but really, his job as Yale head coach was maybe explaining things, teaching players plays and doing stuff like that. But once the game started, Camp was as hands off as could be. Actually, his wife, I haven't said this in the other 3 times I've recorded this, but his wife, uh, Mrs. Camp, I don't remember her first name, she actually became almost an important part of the Yale football team as Camp himself, because if Walter wasn't able to go to a practice because of work obligations, Mrs. Camp would go and she would basically give him reports about what the team was doing and how they were playing. Um, but yeah, so this is all to say that Camp was generally more hands off in his approach to coaching as than we would expect in the modern day and age. But Amos Alonzo Stagg, when he gets hired by the University of Chicago, changes that. He becomes really one of the first professional coaches in football history, and he deserves that title because even before he was at the University of Chicago, he had done amazing things at other football programs before. See, Stagg was an elite player on the Yale football team. He's actually a founding member. He was on the original 1888 All-American team. Camp obviously got to see him play almost every game, and so he put Stagg on the first All-American team. And after he graduated Yale, after 6 years, again, we'll touch on why it's 6 years later, he goes to the YMCA school in Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, for those of you who are sports fans or sports history buffs, you may remember that name because of a guy we mentioned earlier, Mr. James Naismith, who was also a faculty member at the YMCA school there at the same time that Stagg was. And at the YMCA school there in Springfield, Massachusetts, James Naismith invented a little game that became known as basketball. And actually, Camp may have played in some of the original test games of basketball. So there's a very interesting link there, especially because you would think that this is maybe a large school. And the way that they played on the football field, you would, think that it was a large school because Stagg was able to lead his team at the YMCA school to nearly beating Yale, who was one of, if not the best football program in the country at this time. Generally, Yale and Princeton were the top, and then Harvard was a little bit behind them. But he came in and nearly beat his alma mater on the football field. And you think, okay, well, in order to get a good team together, he probably had at least a few thousand students that he could fish players out of or whatever. No, the YMCA school there in Springfield, Massachusetts, had a enrollment of 42 students, not 4,200, not 42,000, 42 students. He was able to put together 11 players from that school and made them play so well that they nearly beat the best team in football, 42. It's amazing that a school so small could have both one of the greatest college football coaches of all time, or at least one of the most important college football coaches of all time, and the inventor of basketball on their faculty at the very same time. It's absolutely ridiculous for the circumstances to align like that. But anyway, Stagg was a great coach. And in 1892, he comes to the University of Chicago, and almost immediately, the football team starts to succeed. Actually, funnily enough, in Camp's first year as head coach at the University of Chicago, he actually also plays quarterback on that team, too. We're going to discuss how he's able to do that later. But yeah, he plays quarterback on that first team while serving as the head coach. And by the mid 1890s, the University of Chicago is now a prestigious university. It overtakes Northwestern as the elite sporting school in Chicago, and they are playing major games versus the other major athletic and academically prestigious university in the Midwest at the time, the University of Michigan. They play these huge games on Thanksgiving Day, where we get rivalry week now. Again, if you're familiar with the concept from modern college football, this begins all the way back in the 1890s when the University of Michigan and the University of Chicago played these massive games on Thanksgiving Day, generally in big cities like Chicago, to sell out crowds, 30, 40,000 people, which is a lot at that time, coming to watch these two teams battle it out. And so Stagg makes the University of Chicago a football powerhouse, fulfilling Walter Harper's uh, idea that having a great football team establishes some additional prestige for the university. It really ends up working out well for the University of Chicago. And there's also some various other first we'll talk about here shortly. There's the first football, or briefly, there's the first night game that takes place in Pennsylvania between Wyoming Seminary and Mansfield Normal School. You may think that's a long distance to travel. For some reason, there's a Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania. I'm not 100% sure, but they end up playing a 0-0 tie in 1892 in the first night game ever. They attempted to have some electric lights to light the field. Again, this is around the same time as the Columbian Exposition, 1893. The White City electricity is starting to take off. Unfortunately, in this little valley in Pennsylvania, the lights that they have are just not good enough. They play 10 plays. It's about 20 minutes long. They give up the game at half-ish because nobody can see what's going on, not even the players. In 1896, the first indoor football game is held between the Amos Alonzo Staggs University of Chicago and the University of Michigan in Chicago. See, again, like I was saying, those games were so important and so big that they decided they could have one in store. There was a place called the Chicago Coliseum, which is unfortunately, or even shortly afterwards, burnt down to the ground. But it was so big. It was, I believe, 7 acres of floor space in the Chicago Coliseum that they actually had enough room to play a full-size game of football. And then, if you places like the Alamo Dome or wherever Idaho plays, the Kibbie Dome, all the Mercedes-Benz Dome, all these domes, Lucas Oil Field, Ford Field, all these domed indoor football could directly be traced back to 1896 in the Chicago Thanksgiving Day football clash between the University of Michigan and the University of Chicago. Finally, the last little interesting tidbit I want to mention in this, we could go later on at some other lecture about it, going into more details on some of the great teams, great players, great coaches of this era. But last team I do want to mention is the 1899 Sewanee Tigers football team. See, Sewanee, small university out here in Tennessee, and they went undefeated in 1899, outscoring their opponents something like 300-10. And of their 11 games that they played, 10 of them were shutouts. And the most interesting thing about those is that 5 of those 10 games that were shutouts occurred within 1 calendar week. And you may think, oh, well, Swanee is a small school, so they probably played small universities, or they probably played high school teams, which is something that was common back then, or they played athletic clubs or whatever. No, those Swanee Tigers, they played within the calendar week. They played such football powers as Texas A&M, Texas, Tulane, LSU, and Ole Miss in 5 days. Shut them all out. The only team that scored on them in that whole year was not during this 1 week. I believe it was the week after this terror week that the Swanee Tigers went through. It was Auburn, who was coached by future head coaching great. We'll discuss more hopefully in the next lecture, by the name of John Heisman. That name may sound familiar. We'll talk about that later on. But John Heisman's Auburn Tigers football team actually scores on the Swanee Tigers, and they end up, but Swanee ends up pulling out the victory. Really, they are a deserving national title, uh, at least qualifier, if not actually winner, in 1899. You generally, we'll touch on that later on. But, yeah, so great team. It is immortalized by Grantland Rice, the famous sports writer based out of Tennessee, who says that they played those Swanee Iron Men, is what he calls them. They played those 5 games in 6 days, and then he says on the 7th day they rested, quoting the Bible there. But so we're seeing this spread of football all over the country. But as there's more eyes on football, controversy begins to arise around the game. See, the major problem that football, especially this 1888 rule set, creates is that the game is violent now. Now, football had always been violent. It had always had some form of violence to it. But this version of football becomes a lot more violent than anybody had ever seen before. See, tackling below the waist, even just by that, if you tackle below the waist, especially in a time before helmets existed, you're getting kneed and kicked in the head quite often, causing a lot of brain damage and brain injuries, which is even at the time very noticeable, by players and by spectators off the field. And the way that the game has to, or the way that the strategy of the game evolves in order to actually make the offense viable, also becomes very dangerous. And this is where we cross over here to the other side of the board, because in 1894, or excuse me, 1892, a guy by the name of Warren F. Deland, that's how you pronounce it, Deland, he is a fan of the Harvard football team. And unfortunately, Harvard is just not as good, even though they were the ones that really brought rugby-style football to the United States. They're just not as good as Yale and Princeton. Those are the 2 big teams at the time. But Harvard and Deland comes up with a strategy for the Harvard football team based off of Napoleonic tactics. See, Napoleon had this concept in his military strategy that you want overwhelming force on a small area. If you have an overwhelming force on a very small area, you can punch through and create diversions, eventually flank or whatever around. But Deland uses this overwhelming force in a small area and comes up with a play called the flying wedge, is the way he calls it. And so the way the flying wedge works is, at the time, there's no limit on how many men can motion before the snap of the football. So the idea is to get as many men flying, running as fast as possible before the motion, targeting a specific area. So in the flying wedge, you have 2 groups of players. You have your center and your quarterback and your running back, or fullback probably. This group over here of men is your light, fast guys here. Behind these guys is the big heavies, who would later become basically your offensive line, your ends and whatever. Now, at the quarterback's signal, when the quarterback says down, set, or whatever, the group of small men begin running as fast as they can towards the line, generally picking out a weak-looking player along the defense in order to target him. Their goal is to hit this guy as fast as possible, creating a hole. Now, obviously, once that hole is created, the rest of the defense is going to come in and try to stuff the hole. So that's where these guys come in. Once these light guys begin their motion, there's a timing that happens with these other guys behind, so that once these guys are up here, these guys are real close behind. And once these guys are real close behind, the quarterback snaps the ball, play begins, hands the ball off to the fullback. The fullback hits the hole that's created by the light men going as fast as possible, hits the line, and then when these guys collapse, it is the goal of the big men to come in behind and shove the fullback forward, attempting to brawl their way through the mass of defenders that are now coming to try to capture or to tackle the ball carrier. Now, this wedge could go off in this direction or that direction or whatever, but this is the flying wedge, and it is a dangerous, dangerous play. See, again, if you are a fan of modern football, you remember that over the last decade or so, the NFL and college a lot less, but mostly the NFL has been really worried about head injuries, especially regarding kickoff plays, where under the old rules, both teams basically got a running start at each other and they collide in the middle, running as fast as possible. This creates a lot of injuries because they're too, it's a conservation of momentum. That both, this will, these guys going as fast as possible, this guy's going as fast as possible, and basically by the absolute, they're going twice as fast. It's like twice as fast into a brick wall. Is what both these players are feeling, and so we get that here with the flying wedge. This guy's job is basically to go and punch a hole, specifically on one player, in the line of scrimmage here. And these guys are supposed to follow along and re-hit that hole, going as fast as possible. A lot of danger, Again, people are mashing into each other heads on. And not only is this happening, once the player hits the gap and once the player gets into the hole, this becomes a scrum. Not in the scrummage that of rugby style, but literally a mass of players attempting to rip each other's heads off in this mass of humanity, where somewhere in there's a guy with a football that they're trying to tackle. And at this point, not only is there no limitation on how many men you can have in motion, but there's also no limitation on how you can treat the ball carrier. Not only, well, really the main thing is that these ball carriers quite often had, literal straps and handles attached to their uniforms, and the players, especially the big men, were to jostle and pull and push them, as far as they could go. Nowadays, obviously, if you see a play like that and it ends up with two people kind of pushing on each other, they blow the play dead. There was not happening in this time and place. So these players, the running back, whoever's got the ball, is in the mass of humanity here. And not only are they being pushed and pulled legally, but also quite often there's a lot of dirty play that's going on in the center of that pile that nobody understands, or nobody, could really do anything to stop. There's a lot of punching and kicking, blatantly late hits, and these blatantly late hits and just the overall, mass of humanity and crashing into each other eventually causes deaths. Because again, we're not playing in a time before protective equipment. If you get one bad hit on your neck or on your temple or anything like that, you could die. There's a famous player I believe it was a Georgia football game, who was in the middle of one of these scrum piles and literally gets his head stepped on and literally dies on the field. And that's not an uncommon story. That's a named player, but he is not alone. We're going to get to here in a second, but we don't have complete statistics for all of the years, leading up to really kind of the change in direction for football. But 23 people die in 1890 playing football at all sorts of levels. And that number stays the same in the next few years, too. In 1895, when the public outrage over football and the deaths it causes, it's actually relatively a low number in comparison to many of the other years. There's only 19 players who die. Eventually, in 1909, it gets all the way up to 26, and we'll discuss these numbers here in a second. But really, this is an outright dangerous game on the field. I can't even describe to you how dangerous it was because, again, not only is the actual, like, the way that the game is intended to be played very physical and violent, but also the referees, especially in these big Eastern schools, when they play, the referees let them get away with literal murder quite often. Again, not literal murder, but as close to it as you could possibly get. There's a real famous Harvard Yale game, I believe, that it really ends in kind of violence, and I'll discuss it later. Hopefully, when we have a story time, whatchamacallit, class professor hour or whatever. When we have one of those, we'll discuss that more in depth there. But so the play is violent, is absolutely violent. But and that gets a lot of the negative press about football. But there's other issues that are boiling under the surface. Another issue that gets some airplay in the media at the time is violent students. See, really, in all honesty, colleges were always very violent at this point. Again, young men all together, not real much to do. They're going to pick fights. They're going to fight each other. There's going to be violence that occurs, especially at this time when violence is a lot more of a part of life than it is nowadays. But there are, in the 1890s, a series of violent outbursts on college campuses, and in the media, they blame football in the same way that people blame violent video games and violent movies and violent TV for a lot of the ills of today's world. They say that football, they see the violence on the football field, and these students decide to reenact that violence in their own, personal lives. I would personally argue that generally, again, not talking about very specific instances that violence did occur, but generally violence actually kind of went down during these 1890s, 1900s era, because it gave football gave something for students to do instead of sitting in their dorm rooms stewing about whatever perceived slights that Joe had, when he took the last muffin or whatever. Now, or when he stole something, that was something that actually one of the things that was that they blamed on the violence of football was somebody stealing something, kind of the posse justice of, a student came in and shot the guy. Again, this is stuff crazy nowadays, but at the time it would have been a lot less, insane, or it would have still been as insane, but it would have been a lot more common at that time period. But all that to say that violence actually kind of drops a little bit, but while the actual violence on on campus dies down, there is a series, a growing concern of basically football hooliganism as we would know it today. Especially if you go back, look at England in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in their peak era of football hooliganism. A lot of that also occurs on American college campuses when it comes to these football games, especially in the South. Even in the 1890s, before they really develop any national powers, that comes even in the next decade or two. But even at that time, these southern schools really care about football, and they almost, or quite often, or many riots begin, at the outcome of these football games. There's even a story I was reading that between a game between Clemson and the University of South Carolina, USC, the USC students were on the Clemson campus and they were doing a parade, and the parade eventually kind of starts encroaching upon the main campus building, and the USC students are becoming a little bit more riotous. They've got sticks and clubs and stuff like that. And Clemson, who I believe still does have a strong military ROTC tradition at their university, their ROTC comes out with guns to protect their campus, main campus building, and it really looks like they're about to be shots exchanged over this football parade when the USC coach comes out and really kind of implores both sides to stand down. It's just a football game. And eventually, the two sides do disperse, but even still, there's a polite applause between the two groups, like, "Oh, you all back down, or you all accepted our challenge, or whatever." It's like, guys, you all just shot each other over just a football game. So there is a sense of this football hooliganism, um, which I think is maybe more of a part of the culture itself than maybe an outcome of the games. Like, again, through a imagery of violence being spread towards from the football field into the classrooms. But finally, the last major controversy of this era, um, it's not one that's really shown a lot in the media, but this is a controversy within the football sphere itself, which is the idea of tramp players. A tramp being like a hobo, wandering players. Um, Quite often, the best teams of this era hired basically professional football players to play on their teams. Again, this is a situation that's going to be examined or repeated over and over and over again about bagmen and players hiring for money, all that sort of stuff. It's going to be something that happens throughout the history of college football up until and really including the modern day where we actually legally pay players. There's always been issues with paying players under the table, but in this case, not only are they paying players, but they're basically paying professional athletes to play on these college football teams. There's numerous stories of players. A big game between two rivals, and one of the rivals produces this great player. He comes in, he single-handedly wins them the game, but nobody knows who he is. He's not on any campus rolls. He's not enrolled in the university. He's never been to a class. And once the team gets back to their home town, the player is gone. Really, this is a concept of people are literal professional football players roaming from town to town, playing in these games, making money, and then leaving the next day. And while this is cheating, it's supposed to be intercollegiate, not professional football. But not only is that, is it cheating in that sense, it's also dangerous because these professional players, oftentimes they are much older than the college kids that they're playing against. Imagine Micah Parsons from the Dallas Cowboys coming and playing on a, I don't know, Tennessee Tech's football team or whatever, because Tech gave him 30 grand to play one game. Micah Parsons or somebody of that caliber, a fully grown adult man, is going to manhandle a still developing 18 to 20-year-old kid. And that happens quite a bit. Even some of the greats of the sport of the time really kind of got their start in being tramp players. Fielding Yost, the great Michigan coach who had the point-a-minute offense of the early 1900s, when he was a little bit younger, he was a law student at the University of West Virginia. And I guess during one of his breaks, he traveled down to play for Lafayette University in their big rivalry game. Came there, played a game, won it, and then went right back to West Virginia, to finish up his law school. Eventually, he becomes a coach of West Virginia football, and he is accused and does use tramp players there. And when he becomes the coach of Michigan, again, there's a lot of rumors that he's using tramp players. At the very least, if he wasn't using tramp players like literal professionals that he was paying, there's a lot of concerns about how academically rigorous are the students. Are they actually going to classes? Are they really on the rolls of these universities? These are questions that are popping up about star players all over the country. But with all these controversies, and we're finally, or I guess first, before we delve into how they fixed or tried to fix these controversies, we first need to mention briefly who were the guys who really causing these controversies to be publicly known. And really, there's two camps that cause these controversies to become such big deals. Number one is the university presidents, most notably Harvard's president, Mr. Charles Eliot. See, Charles Eliot was the president of Harvard University between 1875 and 1909. And during his tenure as Harvard president, he did a lot of great things for Harvard University. See, he introduced the lecture system at Harvard. If you've been a college student within the last 100 years, you know what it's like to sit in lectures. A lot of that is thanks to Charles Eliot. He introduced professional schools, schools that taught people professions as opposed to the classics, Greek literature, whatever. He also improve the faculty at the university. He improved both the quality and the quantity of professors they had in staffing Harvard University, and thereby he increased the enrollment and increased the prestige and the overall quality of the university. He was a great president for Harvard, but he also uh, down to his core belief that college was something to not only develop the minds of the students, but also to develop the morals of the students. He wanted the people to come out of university feel or not only smarter but more upstanding citizens. And uh, Eliot really believed that college sports did not develop morals. In fact, he thought that they really developed, anti-moral standings. A famous quote from him regarding the baseball team that was in the Ken Burns baseball documentary says that he was basically upset that the Harvard baseball team won their championship that year because they had a pitcher who could throw a curveball. He thought that the curveball, which is a standard part, even at the time, it was becoming a more standard part of the baseball, game, throwing different pitches in order to, trick the batters. He thought that trickery was not morally upstanding and it was something that should be banned or should be looked down upon by the students of Harvard, not something that should be encouraged. And if he thought that the curveball was bad, think about what he thought when he saw the violence and the trickery and the outright cheating both on and off the field of football teams. He was a very outspoken critic against intercollegiate football. He has a couple of quotes here. He says that football was filled with tricks, surprises, and habitual violations of the rules. Stuff, again, his goal was moral rectitude. Football was the exact opposite, and it bred the exact opposite mentality, at least in his mind, especially at this time. Eventually, he said, in particular, the game of football grows worse and worse as regards foul and violent play and the number and gravity of injuries which the players suffer. See, if Elliot had his way, there wouldn't, and Elliot himself didn't necessarily stand against athletics as a whole. He was in favor of athletics as something to, again, to increase the mental acuity and the physical strength of his students. But football, while it did that, it ruined, at least in his mind, their moral character. That you had to have some sort of moral flaw in order to win at football. And so he stood against it. And other university presidents, even if they didn't get to the same level of moral crusade against football that Charles Eliot did, they didn't see the goal of football or see the reason that football should exist. It was a diversion. These are older men at the time. They grew up in a time when the university was explicitly and totally about education, and so there wasn't any reason for them or they didn't see any reason for football games to take place. I want to say it was the Purdue president was famously quoted. He was asked by his football team to allow them to travel on a train, down to play some game. And the president says something along the lines of, "I will not allow my team to, take 3 days off of school in order to agitate a bag of wind." He really didn't, or a lot of these presidents, some presidents like Chicago's president saw that football could be used for good, but a lot of the older establishment presidents really saw that football itself was either a useless waste of time or even worse, a actual a moral or showed the moral decay of society. So the university presidents quite often stood against football. They generally allowed it to continue to take place, but usually they were, shaking their heads and scoffing and hoping that there was some way for them to try to ban it in some way or another. But also, along with these university presidents, the other people, and really the more important people when it comes to the moral crisis that becomes football, especially by 1905, is the media, the journalistic elite, the muckrakers, the yellow journalists, and even the progressive era journalists really take a shine to showing the horrors that football can produce. See, uh, originally in the 1880s and 1890s, you are dealing more with yellow journalism. The concept that, if you quote the old news expression, that if it bleeds, it leads. The goal of yellow journalism to a certain point was to shock people into buying newspapers, whether truthfully or untruthfully. That it actually the panic or the moral decays of society would sell newspapers, and the goal was to shock people and say, you have to buy this newspaper because you need to see what is going on, the horrors that are going on, even to the point that that these newspapers, especially up in New York with William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, they arguably create the public fervor around the Cuban independence movement against Spain. Eventually, when the U.S. Ship the Maine explodes off the coast of Cuba, they whip America into a frenzy to start a war against Spain. And when that war is over, they turn their attention away from the ills or the war, and they have to come up with some new boogeyman, to stoke up passions against, and they end up, or at least partially, choosing football because football it does have a lot of boogeymen in its closet. It's got a lot of skeletons both on the field and in its closet, but in the grand tradition of yellow journalism, they may have juiced some of the numbers. We're going to touch on it a little bit later, but these numbers may in fact be inflated because we are getting most of these numbers from the newspapers themselves. And especially at the time, newspaper journalistic practices weren't exactly the best. But even still, as we transition into the 20th century and we enter the progressive era, uh, the not only are the yellow journalists who are just writing to, basically what we would now call clickbait, to sell newspapers, the progressives also latch on to football, but that's for a true moral crusade. They truly believe that the violence on the football field is a bad thing, which it is, and they are writing in order to stop the violence or to try to control it in some way. So as we get into this more progressive era, not and we move away from the yellow journalist era into the more progressive newspaper era, um, even still, the football is a major target for these institutions, and we're going to see that the newspapers and the court of public opinion really help shape the need for change in 1905. Once we get to our next lecture, but and we end with this here because this growing controversy, it's growing, and so the institutions around football are not going to stand or sit on their hands and wait for these controversies to completely ruin or kill their game. So Camp and the IFA, the his rules committee, basically, they begin to come up with new things, and just generally the football establishment is coming up with new solutions to try to confront some of these controversies. First thing being the establishment of conferences. See, conferences are now set up, or athletic conferences are now being set up to try to keep tramp players out of the teams, is to establish eligibility requirements for football players. Most notably, the first, or at least the oldest, athletic conference that's still around is the Intercollegiate Conference of Faculty Representatives. And again, this is also a system. These athletic conferences are a system that the faculty, the presidents, and their staffs can actually use to try to control football and keep it, much more kosher, to the public image. The Intercollegiate Conference of Faculty Representatives is founded in 1896. That would become known as the Western Conference, eventually going by the nickname based off of how many teams they had there, the Big Ten, which is still around today. And there's also the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association, which is founded in 1894. This is kind of a precursor to the SEC and the ACC, but this is a lot less faculty oriented. It's a much broader base. There's not really much institutional control. It really kind of goes, its own separate ways, and eventually ends up splitting into more SEC and ACC schools. But the conferences, the faculty, the athletic departments at these schools come together and they create rules for eligibility of players. And that's not to say that controversy goes goes completely out the window, that there's no longer any controversy over who plays and who doesn't play. Actually, the University of Michigan joins and then leaves the Western Conference based off of eligibility disputes, especially regarding their all-time great player, Germany Schultz, the man who most people agree invented the linebacker position in football. Germany Schultz is there's a lot of questions that are raised about his eligibility to play, and so Michigan ends up leaving the Western Conference for a period and then coming back. So there's still debates over eligibility, but the conferences are intended to try to squash them and try to get everybody on the same page when it comes to the eligibility of players. And this is done so that football, one, this solves the problem, but two, it doesn't allow football to just be, killed. We still are going to be able to play these games, and especially a lot of the reforms that the presidents were looking for would have killed football in the form that it was already beginning to take shape in. It would have eliminated the big Thanksgiving Day money games. It would have, I think there was even, if I remember correctly, there was even suggestions that they play it every other year, instead of playing it every year in the fall. It would have done numbers to the monetary value of football. And so these conference officials allow these big money things to happen, allows for football to still be a big business, especially because the Western Conference isn't made up of the really small schools in the Midwest. These are made up of the major universities: Indiana, Purdue, University of Chicago, Northwestern, Michigan eventually, Ohio State eventually. All these big schools in the Midwest group together, all these big football powers group together and create this conference to give themselves a better image, just like the National or the American League would have done in baseball previously, a sense of we have somebody who's in charge and this is who's making the rules now, but also still allowing them to make money. In 1894, changing gears, they banned the flying wedge, something it took them 2 years for them to ban the flying wedge. See, Camp and his rules committee, the IFA, really thought once they got to 1888 and 1890-ish, they thought that their game was done. It was completed. They didn't need to change anything, that it was perfect as was. But things kept coming up, and they kept on having to make rule changes that they really did not want to make. And one of them was banning the flying wedge. They really didn't want to ban the flying wedge, but they had to ban the flying wedge because the controversy around this play was so much that if they hadn't, it would have killed football. So, in 1894, they create a rule that only 3 men are allowed to go in motion before the snap of the ball. But that doesn't necessarily stop mass play from happening. The main problem is that there's any amount of people running full force into each other, and even more so, it's the melee that happens when a tackle is about to happen that is really causing a lot of the damage here. And so this play here is still a mass play. This comes out of the Amos Alonzo Stagg playbook at Chicago. And if you can imagine, let's say these three backers here, they begin their motion, they run that way, and they attack a guy on the edge, and boom, you still have three guys running at the same speed. And then you can have this guy, and then this guy behind can push, and then you start pulling guards, and they begin to push, and still becomes a mass play. It doesn't necessarily solve the issue. It's really a weak solution to the problem, but it gets rid of the quote unquote danger play of the flying wedge. If you can say that this is 100% of the danger scale, this is like a 75 or an 80. But this is the thing that's causing all the controversy. And when they remove the flying wedge, the controversy about violence in football dies down for another decade ish before, again, we get back to 1905, which we'll discuss next lecture. But so they banned the flying wedge, but it does not do enough to curb the violence. But instead of trying to worry about curbing the violence actually on the field that they can see, uh, camp in the football establishment begins what we would now call a public relations campaign in favor of football. In 1894, the same year they banned the flying wedge, Walter Camp releases a book that he calls Football Facts and Figures. And in this book, Camp basically distributes a number of questionnaires to former players, current players, faculty members, anybody who has some kind of relation to football. And he asks them various questions like, is football safe? Have you been injured? If you were injured, how long were you injured? Would you continue to play football? Et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, when he gets them back, the people know who they're writing to. They're writing to Walter Camp, the father of football. And so their answers are very positive towards football. Yeah, I think football is great. I've never been injured. My broken leg, it's not that bad, or whatever. Obviously the results turn out very pro football. And in between the bits of this book that are the facts and figures, there are also several essays by Camp proteges and Camp associates, and by Camp himself, extolling the virtues of football. Because again, we talk about the Christian athletic movement and the idea of athletics as a positive. They latch onto this. They say that football is molding minds, is molding bodies, it's giving people something to do. It's creating strong and healthy men. As long as they don't get hit in the head and die from a broken spinal cord or whatever. And there's even rumors, even at the time, that Camp left out some of the more negative responses to his survey. This book, Football Facts and Figures, this is basically a blatant football propaganda book. But there's also some other third-party, reports that are done about the state of football and how dangerous it was. We get into the early 1900s, and there was a guy by the name of Edwin Dexter, who was a professor at one of the university. He was an actual scientist. He was an actual, professor who knew what he was doing when it came to these kind of qualifications. And he said, of the 22,766 players that he asked questions of, only 2% were seriously injured. Again, that's like 1,400 players, but still only 2% of football players were seriously injured. That's actually a pretty good number, especially when you consider even nowadays our views on the flying wedge and how dangerous football was at the time, which it very much was. At least according to the Dexter report, only 2% were seriously injured and missed time from school and stuff like that. Now, I won't say that this report was perfect. It did not mention or did not describe any of the injuries that actually occurred. Some of these some of the people that did not claim to have serious injuries may have had serious injuries. We don't know any of that stuff. But we do know that this did turn out pro football, but this also turned out pro football in a much more seriously considered way than Football Facts and Figures. But finally, again, we get towards the turn of the century and we see the death figure rising, and we're a decade out from the banning of the flying wedge. And people are realizing, wait, banning that didn't change how violent football was. Banning one play, football is still as violent as ever. And so finally, the camp committee begins to actually try to do some stuff to change the rules of the game. They realize that their game is going to die if they don't change the rules. And so they start trying to change rules. And one rule that they do make that, at least on paper, looks good is that they require 7 men on the line of scrimmage. This is something that's very similar to the modern day where we have the certain amount, I believe it is 7 still, players on the line of scrimmage, or some number of them. Again, I don't 100% know the rule on that, but there is a certain amount of men that are required to be on the line of scrimmage. So if you have 7 of them up here, that means that you only have 4 men in the backfield. If these guys have to stay on the line of scrimmage until the snap, that means the most you can have is 3 guys going in motion. So that should cut down on the mass plays, correct? Well, one, doesn't necessarily, because you can still pull guards and stuff like that. But the second problem with this new rule is that this 7 men on the line of scrimmage rule, only applies between the 25-yard lines. If you're in the middle of the field, you must have 7 players on the line of scrimmage. But once you reach the red zone, which I'm sure they called it the red zone because it was the dangerous, violent zone, you can go back to the old rules with your mass formations and your mass, struggle. See, Camp thought, he was headstrong. He thought that he knew best. He thought his rules were perfect, and so he's like, fine, we'll do a change to make it more safe if y'all want it to be more safe. But you're still gonna have to score the old way. You're still gonna have to do it like the way I want it to be done if you want to score the football. And even in the next year, so that's in 1903 is when they add this rule about having 7 men on the line of scrimmage in between the 25-yard lines. In 1904, they reduce the amount, they backtrack. They reduce the amount of men that you need on the line of scrimmage within the 25-yard lines. They move it down to 6. Again, that means there's 5 players in the back for 4 people that can be in motion. This is 5 here. Just imagine this guy moved up. That really doesn't change the play that much. Especially because this is a time when, obviously you were only running. This is at a time before the forward pass is invented. We're going to touch on that in 1905. But this is before the forward pass. They knew that they're going to run the ball. And so the problem becomes, you still have these mass plays. You still have the mass plays. It doesn't fix the problem. And again, once you get to the red zone, all those rules go out the window again. So it really doesn't make much sense. The Eastern establishment really thought that their rules that they had, had created and developed over these many years, which, there's a basis of great rules in this game, but they just did not see the error in front of their face. They did not see the violence that was inherent in the system. And whenever somebody brought up something in order to try, they, rightfully brought up the violence that was in the game and how many people were dying playing football, they didn't think that they needed to change anything. Actually, Stagg himself, who would actually really step up and try to help change some of these rules, Stagg had a quote, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was basically like, we don't care when people die in the mills and the factories, if they're making money. People don't care about that. Why should we basically care about football? Like, they're going to die too. People are going to die. Basically, kind of you got to break some eggs to make some omelets kind of statement. But like I said, the establishment, especially the Eastern establishment, really didn't feel like they needed to change the rules. But as we'll get to in next lecture, by 1905, the currents of the culture are moving rapidly against football. Something has to be done. And if these Eastern elites aren't going to do it, somebody is going to step in and do it, even if it might be the President of the United States. But we'll touch on that next week or next time. Thank you all so much for watching this Bensylvania University lecture, Lecture 2 in our College Football 101 series. If you would like to, please subscribe to the channel so you can see all the upcoming lectures for this series on the history of college football. If you like the video, please give it a like. Leave a comment down below what you'd like to see us talk about. Again, we hopefully want to talk more about some of the great teams, players. If you have anything that you want to see, please let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I've been Professor Ben for Bensylvania University, and I will see you all next time.